The Storm Line off Omaha Beach. June 19th, 1944. English Channel off Omaha Beach, Normandy. The dawn is the color of lead, and the sea doesn't roll so much as heave. Long, ugly swells lifting landing craft like toys, and dropping them with a hollow slap that carries through steel decking and tired bones. Somewhere behind the grey curtain, the beachhead exists in fragments. Bulldozed sand lanes, wrecked hedgehogs, smoke that never quite clears, and the constant, distant crack of artillery inland. Out here, the men who built things instead of blowing them apart stand on slick pontoons and wet planking, collars up, hands numb around ropes and stanchions, watching the horizon harden into something hostile. The Allied invasion is only days old, and already the rhythm of survival has become mechanical. Ships offshore, cargo swinging, trucks crawling down floating roadways, stretchers moving the other way. It's a fragile miracle assembled in plain sight, an entire port conjured from concrete and steel, anchored to an open beach as if the sea could be negotiated like a contract. They've called it Mulberry A, the American harbor, and the parts have names that sound almost cheerful when you say them fast. Phoenix caissons, giant hollow concrete blocks sunk in rows to form a breakwater. Bombardons, floating steel cruciforms meant to blunt the worst of the swell. Whale roadways, flexing bridge spans riding on pontoons to carry men, vehicles, and crates from ship to shore. And at the end, the spud piers, their legs driven down like enormous stakes, so the working platforms can rise and fall with the tide, but stay rooted in place. Nothing about it feels cheerful now. The wind increases by degrees, each gust snatching voices away and replacing them with a higher whistle through cables and chains. A US Navy Seabee on the roadway, boots sliding, tool belt clinking, leans down to check a coupling pin and feels the bridge shudder under him as a swell hits from a new angle, not the gentle push that lets the whale flex like it was designed to, but a sideways wrench that turns the metal into a living thing, unhappy and straining. On a nearby platform, a coxswain tries to keep a small craft from smashing itself to pieces against a pontoon. His engine revs, then chokes, then revs again, the propeller biting air as the stern lifts. Farther out, Liberty ships sit at anchor with their bows yawing, each one a warehouse of ammunition, fuel, rations, and spare parts that the men on the beaches will need tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. The officers who authorized this gamble, men like General Dwight D. Eisenhower and Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, are not standing on this soaked decking, but the weight of their decision is. If the floating roads fail, if the breakwater opens, the invasion does not simply slow down, it starves in full view of the enemy. The storm doesn't announce itself with a single dramatic blow, it tightens like a fist. A bombardon rises on a swell and drops into a trough with a metallic groan, and for a heartbeat the men can hear the sound of something bigger than any one ship, an entire artificial harbor, starting to argue with the sea. The argument becomes a shouting match by mid-morning, June 19th, 1944, and the men can feel it travel through every bolt and hinge. The wind veers and freshens, the swells grow steeper, and the whole geometry of Mulberry A begins to twist under forces it was never meant to take head-on. A US Army engineer officer, captain by the look of his helmet markings, moves along the wet decking with a notebook pressed to his chest like it can shield him from water and shrapnel alike, shouting orders that are shredded by gusts before they reach the next man. "Get the lashing lines doubled! Keep that span pinned!" he bellows, pointing to a whale roadway joint where the steel fingers rise and fall, clacking like teeth. The roadway is doing what it was built to do, flexing, absorbing, surviving. But the sea is now striking in rhythm, not random. Every swell lifts the floating span, every trough snaps it down, and the couplings take the punishment, metal on metal, again and again until the movement changes from controlled to violent, as if a hinge has begun to loosen. Out beyond the breakwater line, a bombardon, one of the floating steel cruciforms meant to dampen the swell, bucks hard, then slews sideways, its moorings taut as piano wire. The men on the maintenance craft see the chain lines rise from the water at a harsh angle, shivering, and one of them, seaman second class, face raw from salt, points at the link nearest the surface where the constant jerking has started to throw bright flashes of bare metal through the black paint. "It's sawing through," he says, and the boatswain beside him doesn't answer, because he can see it too. The sea is filing the moorings down by brute repetition. Inshore, the Phoenix caissons, those massive concrete blocks sunk to create an artificial harbor wall, take the swell and throw spray skyward in sheets that crash back like bucketfuls of gravel. For a time they hold. They are the nearest thing to immovable objects in this floating city, but between them, gaps breathe, and the sea finds every opening it can widen. A working party tries to secure a pontoon that has begun to drift, its fenders pounding against the pier legs with a hammering that makes your teeth ache. Ropes snake across the deck, hands reach, knots cinch, and then a swell hits and the line goes bar-tight. A man's glove slips, skin tears, and he bites back a shout as blood mixes with rain. On the shoreline, military, police, and truck drivers, men who never signed up to fight the ocean, watch the floating roads sway and feel an entirely new kind of fear settle in their stomachs. They can handle shellfire because you can see where it comes from. You can dig in, you can move, you can retaliate. The sea offers no target, only weight. A Liberty ship offshore starts dragging anchor, its bow slowly slewing, and the officer of the deck radios frantic bearings. If it swings into the harbor structures, steel hull and concrete port will collide like giants. And now the first failures begin to appear, small enough that anyone could pretend they're manageable. A mooring line parts with a crack like a rifle shot. A pontoon shifts. A section of whale roadway lifts higher than it should and slams down with a metallic scream that carries even over the wind. The captain with the notebook looks at the horizon. White caps everywhere, the storm line thickening, and for the first time he allows the thought to form, cold and unwanted. If this keeps building through the night, Mulberry A will not just be damaged, it will be torn apart in pieces, each one a separate disaster. By late afternoon, the sky drops lower, and the light that filters through the storm looks like it's coming from underwater. Every surface shines, every edge is dangerous, and the men on the harbor structures move with the careful, exhausted precision of people handling explosives. The wind is now a steady shove that turns into sudden punches, and the rain comes in sheets that blur the boundary between sea and air until you can't tell where the next wave ends and the next gust begins. A Navy lieutenant, slicker flapping around his legs, clambers onto a spud pier platform and stares at the legs, those huge steel piles meant to keep the pier steady as it rides the tide, watching the platform shiver as the swell tries to lever it sideways. The pier is supposed to rise and fall like an elevator. Instead, it is being twisted, the deck canting enough that loose gear begins to slide, clanging toward the downslope until sailors throw themselves after it. Over the radio, voices overlap. Reports of a Rhino ferry breaking loose, an LCT taking damage, a section of whale roadway bending like a ribbon, and somewhere near the bombardon line, a mooring station gone silent. The lieutenant cups a hand over his headset and tries to keep his tone calm as he relays orders to pull small craft clear before they get smashed to kindling, but the truth is already visible. Out beyond the breakwater, the sea has grown teeth. A bombardon finally gives up its fight. The strained metal of its mooring snaps free, and the steel cruciform swings broadside to the waves, rolling with a helpless, slow majesty before disappearing behind a crest. The men watching it don't cheer and they don't curse. They simply fall quiet, because the bombardons were the first line of confidence, the things that told you this harbor could tame open water, and now one of them is just another drifting hazard. Inshore, the Phoenix caissons continue to take the punishment, but the water piling against them finds the seams and hammers through, turning the supposedly sheltered side into a boiling chop that batters every pontoon and pierhead. A CB chief petty officer, weathered face, jaw clenched, grabs two men by their sleeves and drags them away from a roadway joint just as the span lifts and slams down again, the coupling pins jumping in their housings. "You want your hands after this?" he shouts, and one of the men shakes his head violently, either to answer or to fling rain out of his eyes. Offshore, ships strain at anchor. One LST wallows and yaws, deck lights smeared into yellow streaks by the rain, and the officer of the deck is praying his chain holds, because if he drifts into the harbor works, he'll crush them and still end up in the surf. Along the Omaha shoreline, DUKW amphibious trucks, normally the lifeline that runs cargo from ship to beach, sit stalled and useless, their drivers ordered to hold because the surf is too brutal to risk the crossing. Trucks that should be receiving ammunition and fuel are now stacked idle behind dunes and wreckage, and the men ashore can hear the storm assaulting the harbor like a siege. Metal shrieks, chains snap, timbers crack, and every so often a deeper boom when something heavy collides. Pontoon to pier, craft to caisson, steel to concrete. Darkness arrives early, not with a clean sunset, but with the slow suffocation of light, and the lieutenant on the spud pier feels a sick certainty as he watches the pierhead lamps sway and sees, through the rain, shapes drifting where nothing should drift. Pieces of the harbor itself, set free and now moving under the storm's command. Sometime after midnight, June 20th, 1944, when the tide turns but the wind refuses to, Mulberry A stops feeling like a structure and starts feeling like a wreck in slow motion. And the men on it realize they are no longer maintaining a harbor. They are evacuating a collapsing machine. A U.S. Army Transportation Corps lieutenant, sent out with a small party to assess damage on the leeward side, steps onto a pontoon and nearly goes to his knees as the deck lurches. He catches a stanchion, knuckles white, and the metal is vibrating so hard it buzzes through his gloves. His flashlight beam skitters across wet steel, catches a coupling where the whale roadway meets the pier, bolts half backed out, pins dancing, and then the span rises on a swell higher than he's ever seen it rise, hangs for a breath as if the sea is deciding where to throw it, and slams down with a violence that makes the whole line shudder. Somewhere along the roadway, a joint fails. Not a clean break, but an ugly tearing, a sound like giant canvas ripping, followed by the grinding crash of steel edges scraping past each other. "Span's gone!" Someone screams into a handset, and the words are swallowed by wind, but the meaning is obvious. The floating road has snapped its chain of survival, and the far end is now whipping in the surf like a broken limb. The lieutenant backs away, eyes stinging with salt, and sees a rhino ferry, a boxy pontoon barge meant to carry vehicles, hammered sideways into a pierhead, its corners punching, recoiling, punching again until the fenders burst and the blows turn into raw metal impacts. Men on the ferry scramble, trying to cut away lines before the next wave pins them. One slips, caught by a comrade's arm just in time, both of them soaked and shaking. Out beyond the caisson line, the absence of the bombardons is now felt as a physical change. The swell that used to break in a ragged, dampened pattern now surges in clean, powerful sets, shouldering through every gap and turning the supposed harbor into a chaotic bowl. The Phoenix caissons, those massive concrete ships sunk in rows, begin to betray their limits not by moving, but by failing to shelter. Water pours through breaches and around ends, and the sheltered side becomes as murderous as open sea. A Navy salvage officer, lieutenant commander, stands in a pitching craft with a megaphone he can barely keep hold of and calls for all small boats to clear, his voice hoarse with command and disbelief. "Get off the works. Clear the works." The response comes as frantic blinks of signal lights and scattered shouts, but the storm answers louder. Mooring chains part with rifle crack snaps. A pontoon tears free and swings like a pendulum. A section of roadway, still attached at one end, rises and slams, rises and slams. until the remaining fastenings shear and it floats away into darkness. On Omaha's beach, a military policeman crouches behind a dune and watches the faint moving lights offshore, trying to interpret what he's seeing. Then a new sound reaches him through the gale, a deep, sustained roar as something enormous grinds against concrete, and he realizes the harbor itself is colliding with its own breakwater. By dawn, such as dawn can be in a storm like this, the Americans will find parts of Mulberry A scattered, twisted, sunk, or adrift, pierheads wrecked, whale roadways broken, pontoons smashed, and the carefully planned unloading rhythm shattered. But in this hour, in the blackened spray, it is only a series of immediate, terrifying problems. Men to pull clear, lines to cut before they drag you under, and the dawning truth that the sea has decided the Omaha harbor will not be allowed to exist. Dawn on June 20th, 1944, comes in a bruised smear of light, and what it reveals off Omaha is not a harbor, but a battlefield of engineering. Concrete blocks looming like half-sunk fortresses, broken roadway spans bobbing at strange angles, pontoons smashed and drifting, and small craft pinned in places they were never meant to be, their hulls grinding as the sea keeps working them like tools. The storm hasn't eased. It has only changed pitch. The wind still hard, and the waves still arriving in sets that lift wreckage, shove it forward, and drop it with a crash that echoes across the water. On the beach, officers and NCOS stand with field glasses and clenched jaws, trying to calculate catastrophe while wet maps flap against knees. A U.S. Army logistics officer, Major, face drawn, helmet strapped tight, walks through a line of idle trucks and feels the invasion's bloodstream slowing. Fuel dumps that were supposed to be replenished daily, ammunition stocks that were meant to build into a cushion, rations that could be stretched but not conjured. Each crate offshore is now a question mark, each anchored ship a stranded warehouse. He moves to a radio truck and listens as naval voices report what the men can already see. Mulberry A is effectively out of action, its unloading capacity shattered, and the sea state is too violent to repair while it's still breaking things. "We can't keep the DUKWs running," a harried beachmaster says, voice crackling. "Surf's chewing them up." The major looks toward the waterline where amphibious trucks, those DUKWs that had been the improviser's dream, sit nose out like animals refusing to enter a flood, their drivers waiting for an order that won't come because the crossing would be suicide. He sees LCTS and LCMS attempting to nose in, the flat-bottomed craft bucking, ramps slamming, some of them broaching sideways and having to back out fast before they're turned broadside and rolled. Somewhere to the west, a wrecked roadway span swings in the surf, and a CB crew on a tug tries to get a line on it. The hook catches, then a wave yanks the tug hard, nearly capsizing it, and the chief petty officer on the deck screams for the line to be cut before it drags them under. The line is chopped, whipping away like a snake, and the roadway continues its slow drift toward the beach, another hazard among mines, obstacles, and the debris of D-Day. By afternoon, the storm becomes a grinding endurance test rather than a single violent moment, and the command decision takes shape in practical orders. Abandon hopes of restoring Mulberry A under fire from weather, shift to direct beach unloading wherever possible, push more landing ships tank, LSTS, onto the sand at high tide, and accept the damage as the price of keeping divisions fed, and start salvaging what can be salvaged. Usable pontoons, intact sections of roadway, any craft that can be refloated. Men wade waist-deep in churned surf with ropes around their torsos, trying to secure floating pieces before the next wave tears them free. Others mark hazards with buoys that disappear and reappear like drowning signals. And through the static and spray, a different set of reports begins to filter in from the British sector to the east, Arromanches, Gold Beach, where Mulberry B is battered but still there, still working, still taking the sea on its concrete shoulders. For the major at Omaha, that survival is both relief and a fresh kind of pressure. If one artificial port lives and one dies, The entire campaign's supply lifeline must bend eastward fast before the storm finishes its work and the front lines inland run out of everything that keeps an army moving. June 20th, 1944. Off Arromanches-les-Bains, Gold Beach. The same storm that has turned Omaha into a graveyard of steel arrives here with no mercy, yet the scene feels different the moment you come within sight of Mulberry Bee. It is battered, soaked, and constantly shaking under the sea's fists, but it is still organized, still a working idea rather than a floating ruin. A Royal Engineers captain, boots slick with algae, stands on a pierhead platform with a Navy liaison officer and watches the breakwater line take the brunt. Phoenix caissons rising like dark cliffs out of the chop, the water exploding against them in white blows that hang in the air before the wind tears them sideways. Behind the caissons, the sheltered water is not calm, but it is survivable, and that distinction is everything. Craft can still maneuver without being instantly thrown into concrete. The captain's face is tight, not with confidence but with calculation, as he tracks the rhythm. Each swell strikes, runs along the line, finds a gap, and tries to claw through. Yet the harbor keeps absorbing, redirecting, and bleeding the energy off. If the line opens, we're finished, he mutters. And the Navy officer, Lieutenant Commander, Royal Navy, answers in the same clipped tone men use when they refuse to tempt fate. Keep the moorings watched. Keep the spans pinned. No heroics. On the leeward side, whale roadway sections flex like living spine bones, rising and settling with a controlled violence, and the spud pier legs groan as the working platform lifts with the tide and then shudders as a cross swell slaps it. Dock crews, some Royal Engineers, some naval ratings, some civilian dock workers drafted into wartime improvisation, move with their heads down, hands on ropes, checking lashings, tightening turnbuckles, replacing chafed lines before they part, because the storm's method is repetition. It does not need one perfect blow, it only needs you to be careless once. A small coaster tries to hold station in the lee, its bow slewing as the helmsman fights the wheel. On the pier, a signalman flags frantic corrections, and you can hear the shouted numbers, yards, degrees, speed, between gusts. The captain steps to the edge, peers down at the caisson line where water is sluicing through an opening, and sees a working party already there in a bobbing craft, trying to reseat a floating element and reinforce the mooring before the gap widens. One man's arm snaps upward in a sharp signal, line secured, then disappears behind spray. Somewhere to the west, the Gooseberry line of block ships, older vessels deliberately sunk to form a sheltered anchorage, takes waves broadside and stays where it was ordered to die, adding another layer of broken water protection. And the British captain cannot help but think of Omaha's exposed approach and the missing outer defenses that the storm exploited. The harbor here is not invincible. A roadway joint bangs hard enough to make men flinch. A pontoon slams its fenders until they smoke with friction, and more than once the Navy officer grabs the rail as the platform lurches and thinks, briefly, of the men in the American sector watching their port dissolve. But Mulberry Bee keeps swallowing cargo. Vehicles inch forward over wet steel, crates swing on hooks, the clatter of chains and the bark of orders continue in the teeth of the gale, and the captain understands the cruel arithmetic. If Arromanches stays alive, the invasion stays fed, even if the lifeline must stretch farther than planned. June 21st, 1944. Normandy, Allied beachhead headquarters. The storm begins to lose its sharpest edge, not by granting calm, but by shifting from a violent assault to a heavy, resentful swell that still punishes anything broken or loose. In a cramped command post with maps pinned to canvas walls and rainwater tracked across the floor, senior officers study reports that read like damage assessments after an air raid. Roadway spans lost, pierheads wrecked, moorings snapped, pontoons scattered, and an American harbor that can no longer be relied upon as a system. A US Navy captain, logistics, not glamorous combat command, leans over the table with a pencil and circles the same words again and again. Unserviceable. Beyond immediate repair. Salvage only. Across from him, an army officer from the communications zone, colonel, eyes tired from days without clean sleep, asks the question that sounds like heresy, only because the plan had been spoken of with such certainty. Do we stop trying to rebuild it? Huh. Outside, you can still hear the sea, and now and then, the deep boom of wreckage settling or colliding as the tides shift. The Navy captain doesn't answer with drama. He answers with numbers and reality. We can't repair under these conditions, he says. Even if we could, the parts are scattered. The seas move the geometry. Every tide will change what's where. The colonel looks down at the beach throughput estimates, what the planners believed they needed to sustain the build-up, then looks up at the hard truth. The invasion is not a single day on June 6th. It is weeks of ammunition, fuel, food, replacement tanks, medical supplies, bridging gear, and the endless, invisible cargo that makes an army more than a line of rifles, and the enemy knows it. German artillery observers inland can still range the beaches. Luftwaffe raids still come at night. The beach itself is a narrow wound in occupied Europe that must be kept open by sheer supply. By afternoon, the decision hardens into orders that travel down chains of command in the most dangerous way possible. Calm, unequivocal, irreversible. Abandon the concept of restoring Mulberry A as a functioning port. Strip it for parts, redirect shipping, increase reliance on direct beach landings, and captured small ports. And, above all, keep Mulberry B operating at Arromanches at any cost, because it has become the beating heart of the logistical plan. At Omaha, the announcement does not feel like defeat so much as triage. A CB commander walks the shoreline with an Army engineer major, both of them staring at pieces of the harbor that have come ashore like shipwreck. Bent steel, broken pontoons, roadway sections twisted into shapes that look impossible until you remember the sea can move anything given time. The CB kicks at a chunk of timber and says, almost softly, "She's done." The major doesn't argue. Instead, they start doing what war always demands after a loss: adapt fast and without sentiment. Landing ships are ordered to dry out on the beach at controlled tides, accepting hull damage as a cost of moving cargo. Bulldozers and D8 tractors are pushed into the surf to carve new exit lanes and keep the sand from swallowing trucks. Salvage crews work the wreckage line, stripping usable fittings, winches, steel plates, and anything that can be repurposed. Pieces of Mulberry A that would have been a monument in peacetime become spare parts in wartime. Offshore, ships are reassigned. Their anchorage patterns change to favor routes that can feed Arromanches and the British sector, and the planners begin to accept a brutal, widening logistical tether. Supplies will come in where the port still lives, and then they will be hauled across Normandy roads that are already churned, cratered, and congested. Somewhere in that same week, Eisenhower's staff will record the decision without melodrama, but the men on the beach feel what it means. The ocean has forced the Allied invasion to improvise on the fly, and now every ton unloaded and every mile driven inland must compensate for the port that the sea ripped away. June 22nd to 24th, 1944. The days after the storm are a blur of controlled desperation along the Normandy coast, the kind of work that never makes a headline, but decides whether headlines will exist at all. At Omaha, the beachmasters and engineers turn the shoreline into a living machine with no casing, everything exposed, everything vulnerable to weather, enemy fire, and simple exhaustion. LSTs come in on high tide and grind themselves onto the sand with a shudder that rattles rivets. Ramps drop, and trucks pour out into surf that still tugs at axles, water lapping at exhaust pipes as drivers keep the engines high and the wheels spinning. A sergeant in a quartermaster unit, mud up to his calves, cigarette soaked but still lit, waves a convoy forward with an arm that feels like it belongs to someone else, shouting at men to keep distance, keep moving, don't stall. Because one dead truck becomes a blockage that backs up everything behind it into a knot the enemy can shell. Bulldozers prowl like animals, pushing crushed metal obstacles aside, carving new tracks where yesterday's lanes have been swallowed by tide or churned into slurry. Seabees lay down steel matting and timber where the sand turns to soup, improvising roads that groan under the weight of loaded deuce-and-a-halfs and Shermans. The sea keeps trying to reclaim the beach, but now the Allies fight it with procedure. Timed landings, disciplined traffic control, constant repair. Offshore, cargo ships that would have unloaded inside Mulberry's sheltered water now transfer to smaller craft when the sea allows. And when it doesn't, they wait, an impatience made physical in creaking anchor chains and officers staring at watches. At Arromanches, Mulberry B becomes a 24-hour artery. Under grey skies, the whale roadways continue their flexing dance, and the spud piers rise and fall with the tide, but the work never stops. Vehicles crawl across wet spans with headlights hooded, engineers tightening fastenings between surges, naval ratings guiding craft into the lee. The British captain from the pierhead watches an endless procession: ammunition, fuel in jerry cans and bulk, rations, bridging gear, medical supplies, replacement gun barrels, and the dull, heavy crates of artillery shells that will soon be expended in the bocage. The storm's damage has not vanished. Sections are stressed, some pontoons damaged, but the harbor's survival has created a logistical pivot point, and the planners exploit it ruthlessly. Convoys fan out from the British sector to feed American units inland. Roads become clogged with Allied traffic so dense that it looks like a city's evacuation, except it's aimed toward the front. Military police in white helmets stand at junctions, turning columns with decisive gestures, holding one line, releasing another, because a traffic jam in Normandy can be as deadly as a German ambush. Overhead, Allied fighters and fighter bombers patrol, hunting for Luftwaffe raiders who might target this exposed supply chain. At night, anti-aircraft guns bracket the sky in nervous bursts whenever an engine note seems wrong. And still, the greatest enemy remains friction. Broken vehicles, fuel shortages, mud, cratered lanes, and the sheer wear of non-stop movement. An Army engineer lieutenant rides in a jeep past a line of exhausted drivers slumped over steering wheels and thinks of the planners who promised a port at Omaha that would make this orderly, who imagined piers and sheltered water and smooth throughput. Instead, he sees 1,000 small acts of stubbornness replacing that lost certainty. Men chaining tires, swapping out axles in the open, unloading by hand in rain, and hauling crates across sand because there is no other choice. The storm that wrecked Mulberry A did not stop the invasion, but it changed its tempo. Everything now costs more effort, more vehicles, more hours, and the men who do the work feel it in their shoulders and their eyes. Yet day by day the stockpiles inland grow again, the guns keep firing, the tanks keep rolling, and the beachhead, meant to be temporary, hardens into a sustained foothold because the Allies refuse to let the sea's victory become Germany's. Late June to early July 1944. As the front line grinds forward through Normandy's hedgerows, the war behind the war keeps unfolding at the water's edge, measured in tonnage, tide tables, and the constant fear of disruption. In staff tents and improvised offices, planners redraw their assumptions in pencil and fatigue. Mulberry A is a loss, but not a total failure of the concept. Mulberry B is proof that an artificial port can survive open coast conditions if the variables fall just right. Site, orientation, blockship shelter, the integrity of moorings, and a relentless maintenance culture that treats every chafed line as a potential strategic disaster. At Arromanches, Royal Engineers and naval crews become guardians of a fragile miracle, patrolling catwalks and pierheads with wrenches and clipboards, tightening, replacing, reinforcing, learning the harbor's moods the way infantry learns a battlefield. A petty officer pauses by a roadway joint and runs a thumb over a bolt head that has started to back out under vibration. He marks it with chalk, calls for a fitter, and the bolt is reseated before the next tide cycle can work it loose. Because by now everyone understands the storm's lesson. The sea doesn't need to be stronger than you once. It only needs you to be sloppy for a moment. Meanwhile, Omaha becomes a laboratory of improvisation. Landing craft schedules are refined, beach exit lanes expanded, and the rhythm of LST drying out is turned into doctrine. Ships in on the tide, cargo off in a time surge, ships pulled free before they're stranded too long. When surf conditions worsen, the system flexes. When they improve, it surges. Seabees salvage Mulberry A like surgeons harvesting usable organs. Winches, pontoons, connectors, steel sections that can be repurposed for beach jetties, causeways, or repairs elsewhere. The wreckage that the storm scattered is slowly stripped of value and folded back into the invasion's machinery, a grim form of recycling that feels almost respectful. Nothing wasted, not even failure. Inland, convoy routes are reinforced. Engineers patch craters and lay temporary bridging. Traffic control becomes a tactical art. A U.S. Army lieutenant colonel in charge of road movement studies maps covered in colored lines, routes, detours, priorities, and speaks to his men as if commanding a battle. Fuel first. Ammo second. Everything else makes room. The result is not elegance, but continuity, and continuity is what wins campaigns. In late June, as Operation Epsom and other offensives draw blood in the bocage, the men at the coast feel the connection. Every artillery barrage inland is a shadow cast by crates unloaded at night. Every tank that noses into a hedgerow gap is a consequence of an LST ramp dropping onto sand. Every evacuation jeep returning with wounded is part of the same system moving in reverse. When rumors spread that the Germans might launch concentrated attacks to push the Allies back into the sea, the beachmasters don't respond with speeches. They respond by pushing more supplies forward, building deeper dumps, hardening the logistics so the front can absorb shocks. At Arromanches, the harbour keeps doing what it was built to do, receiving the mass of an empire's industry and translating it into momentum. You can stand on a pierhead and watch the choreography: coasters, barges, landing craft, trucks, cranes, and realize the port itself is a weapon, one made of concrete, steel, and human discipline. The storm of June 19th to 22nd tried to rip that weapon away. At Omaha it succeeded, at Arromanches it failed, and in that uneven outcome lies a quiet truth of war. Victory is often decided not by a single dramatic battle, but by which side can keep its systems alive when nature, chance, and enemy action all press at once. Mid-July, 1944. Normandy is no longer a thin, precarious strip of sand. It is a widening engine of war pushing against the hedgerows, chewing through villages, and gathering weight for the breakout that everyone can sense coming. Along the coast, the storm's wreckage has been absorbed into routine the way casualties are absorbed into rosters, recorded, mourned in quiet ways, and then replaced by necessity. At Arromanches, Mulberry B still stands in the chop like a stubborn, half-invented city, its phoenix caissons dark against the water, its whale roadways flexing under the endless parade of trucks, and its spud piers rising and falling with the tide as if the sea itself has been reduced to a schedule. A Royal Engineers major walks the pier line with a naval officer, both men older in their faces than they were in June, and they stop where fresh steel plates have been bolted over a stress point cracked by that first great storm. The repair is functional, not pretty, and the major taps it with his knuckles like a man checking armor. She learned, he says, meaning the harbour, meaning them, meaning the entire idea of forcing a port into existence where no port belongs. To the west, at Omaha, the beach unloading is still brutal, still exposed, but it has become a practiced brutality. Causeways improved, lanes hardened, salvage turned into useful structure, and the cadence of ship-to-shore movement refined until it feels less like improvisation and more like doctrine written in mud. The American officers, who once believed Mulberry A would spare them this grind, now lead it with the calm of people who have stopped expecting comfort. When the surf rises, they adjust. When the weather clears, they surge. When a truck stalls, it is pushed aside in minutes because a stalled truck is no longer merely a problem. It is a threat to an entire army's heartbeat. Inland, the consequences are visible in steel and smoke. Artillery fire thickens because shells are arriving. Armored formations grow heavier because replacement vehicles and fuel are arriving. Field hospitals expand because medical supplies and plasma are arriving. The German defenders, watching Allied pressure build, feel something they cannot easily name from their foxholes. The sense of an enemy that should have faltered after losing a harbour, but did not. And in that resilience is the real legacy of Mulberry. Not that it was perfect, not that it conquered the sea, but that it gave the invasion options, when options were the only thing that kept catastrophe from becoming history. When Operation Cobra finally tears open the American sector later in July, it will be fueled by a logistics system that survived a storm's attempt to sever it. The men who tightened bolts on a wet pierhead, who cut mooring lines before they dragged a tug under, who guided LSTS onto sand in the dark, who salvaged twisted steel from Mulberry A and turned it into something useful. Those men will not appear in the footage of tanks racing through dust, but they will be inside that footage, invisibly, as surely as gasoline in an engine. On the Normandy coast, the water keeps moving, indifferent as ever, but the Allies have moved too, learning, adapting, refusing to break. The concrete port that stayed at Arromanches becomes a symbol not of invulnerability, but of persistence under stress, and the port that was lost at Omaha becomes a lesson written in wreckage. In war, even the sea has a vote, and you win by planning for the day it votes against you.